Namaste.
Namaste.
So if I were to retell the story of the Transfiguration to convey its meaning for people from Wisconsin, I would tell it thus. About 8 days after Aaron said these things, he took Eddie, John, and James and went up the mountain to pray. After he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes flashed white like lightning. 2 men, Bart and Brett, were talking with him. As the 2 men were about to leave Aaron, Eddie said to him, "Master, it's good that we're here. We should construct 3 shrines, one for you, one for Bart, and one for Brett." But he didn't know what he was saying. Eddie was still speaking when a cloud overshadowed them. As they entered the cloud, they were overcome with awe. Then a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." Even as the voice spoke, Aaron was found alone.
Oh, Vince.
I believe it's a story about the changing of the guard. I believe it's a story about the 2 great spiritual heroes, if you will, of the Jewish people, Moses and Elijah. Or, if you prefer, the 2 great traditions of the Jewish scriptures. The law, represented by Moses, and the prophets, represented by Elijah. And the fact that, for the people listening to it now, they had found something that fulfilled that in Jesus. But moreover, I think this isn't just a story that they made up to convey that truth. And I think there's a lot of stories in the Bible that were made up to convey the truth, as a way of conveying the truth, that didn't necessarily happen. I think it's entirely plausible that this was some kind of an epiphany, some kind of a vision, maybe even some kind of a dream. Notice in the beginning of it, they're having trouble staying awake. And I don't know, I think we've probably all had those dreams where it seems like we're awake, and you hardly get any rest when you sleep like that, because you think you're awake and doing things, or you think you're awake and thinking about things, but you're really asleep and thinking about things, and it's hard to really draw that line between being awake and being asleep. And so you can, I think you can take the Transfiguration and say, oh, that's just really wild. There's really no way that anything like that could ever happen. But if you start to understand it as perhaps a vision or a dream, then it could entirely happen. And dreams, especially for people who are into Jungian psychology, and I confess I'm not, I just don't get it. It's great if you are. I think that man was a little off his rocker. I much prefer Freud and his phallic symbols. But if you're into Jung and dream analysis and that kind of stuff, this is probably right up your alley. And so the question we're left with is, what about spiritual awakenings? And I confess, I've been listening to Richard Rohr again, and I've been listening to Richard Rohr again because he's on my phone. I have an Audible app, audible.com app on my phone, and because I'm doing the Uber thing, and because most radio stations' playlists are about a dozen songs, man, if you're in your car for 6 or 8 hours, I mean, the 3rd time you hear a song, at least for me, or the first time you hear Taylor Swift, Katy Perry, or I forget who the 3rd, or anything by Britney Spears, and if you should happen to hear even parts of all those 3 in one day, you're left with, I think, 2 choices. One is to open your car door and jump out on the freeway. The second is to find something else to listen to. And so Richard Rohr works really well. And also, if somebody boring is in my car, he can keep playing in my earpiece while they're babbling at me, and I can just go, oh yeah. But he talks about what Trungpa would have called spiritual materialism. But he talks about people who collect retreats. And it's these people who just make a hobby out of going from retreat to retreat, and they don't necessarily gain anything from it. They don't necessarily learn anything there that they put into practice. They just believe if they chalk up enough retreats, somehow that's magical, automatic spiritual practice. And they usually can afford to go to a lot of retreats. And if they just go and don't let it sink in too deep, they're not really asked to change. And yet they can feel as if they're doing something. It's kind of like the New Year's resolution to finally work out. You know, you feel like you're doing something because you're making the resolution, and you go to the gym a couple times and you feel like you're doing it, and then you can just pretty much let it drop away because, well, you did it. And authentic transformation, I think, is much different than that. And what really jumped out at me when I was listening to Aaron read this first reading is when, what's his name? Bruce Davis wrote, "We live in a world where judging others is much more common than finding the humility to look inward at ourselves and find kindness and compassion for all. Spiritual awakening is discovering a world which its very essence is kindness and compassion. How does one live knowing both worlds?" And I think, you know, some of what he wrote about is sort of that thing that happens when you do go on retreat, and then you come out, and all of a sudden, you know, the doorbell rings and the phone rings and people show up you don't want to deal with, and you've been secluded in this place that's quiet and nobody can get to you and nobody knows where you are, and there's a jolt in coming back to the real world. But I think he misses maybe that there's a reason we live in a world where judging others is more common than looking inward, and it's that we're angry. We live in an angry world. And an angry world isn't going to have the time or the patience to look inward. The angry world is going to feel better. And I've certainly been there myself in the past, and at times in the present, where the angry world is going to feel better looking out there and finding out what's wrong. And if the world's angry enough, it'll convince itself that it can't stop being angry until it finds all that stuff that's wrong. And then once it's identified, it'll magically disappear and be happy. And I think maybe he's got it out of order. Maybe what allows us to let go of anger is spiritual awakening. Maybe it's not that we have to stop judging others in order to awaken spiritually. Maybe it's that we have to awaken spiritually to stop judging others and to let go of our anger. Or at the very least, it's a combination perhaps of both, weaving in and out and interacting, so that we can come to a place where a little spiritual growth makes us let go of a little bit of anger, makes us maybe look at ourselves a little bit, which affords us a little growth, which lets us let go of anger. And I think our culture, which is so, you know, give it to me now, give it to me now, almost predisposes us to look for quick fixes and expect quick fixes and expect that authenticity will lead to rapid change. And I don't believe that's the way it works. Way back in the day, 1984, I think, the first Bible study I ever went to was in Newburyport, Massachusetts. And there was a retired firefighter who had the Boston accent. So he was a little fascinating to me at the time, because he'd sit there and talk about the lot. And I thought he was talking about something in his refrigerator, and it turned out, you know, he was talking about God. But he hung out with some nuns who spoke in tongues, which fascinated me too. But they had described the spiritual life to him as sort of, here's God, or the goal of spiritual life, and here's the person on the spiritual journey, and it kind of goes like this. That you draw closer to God and drift away, and you move closer and you drift away, and that's normal. And that if you resist that natural sort of ebb and flow, he compared it to, because we lived in the ocean, to the tide. If you resisted that, you were just going to frustrate yourself. And that if you were open to it, you could find the place for growth even when you were in that cycle that went out, both at low tide and at high tide. And I found the perfect imagery for what happens when you resist that. Last week, I think it was last week, I was piddling around on Facebook, and there was a video of a guy who was running towards the ocean as the wave was going out, and he didn't quite get where the wave was, so he leapt in the air to dive into the water, but the water had gone out, and he just planted in the wet sand. Which, of course, I love that stuff because I'm compassionate. And so, but it's a perfect metaphor for, I think, trying to force our spiritual journey to be what we want, where we want, when we want, how we want. And the truth is, I think if we just flow with it and allow that there's going to be weird things like this transfiguration business that may come to us in dreams, they may come to us when we're kind of just present but not expecting anything. And they may take us a long time to sort out and interpret. But I think they are important. And I think if we close the door on the possibility of them existing, we close the door on a huge potential in that ebb and flow of the spiritual life. We may miss out on meaning just because we refuse to admit that it might be there. And in doing so, end up like that guy diving into the water as it just pulls away. Amen.